adapting to wealth is often harder than people anticipate.
That's our guest, prominent family wealth psychologist Dr. Jim Grubman. And today, we're cutting through the static of the often unexpected challenges many prosperous families encounter when adapting to the complexities of wealth, even, and perhaps especially, amid a global pandemic. I'm Damien Martin, and this is Simply Tax, a podcast dedicated to strengthening your tax mind. So what's a tax guy like me doing talking with an internationally recognized family wealth consultant to high net worth and ultra high net worth families, advisors, and family offices? As a tax advisor to privately held businesses and their owners who focuses on the intersection of the two, my primary role and passion is the tax aspects of assisting affluent families manage and transfer multi-generational wealth. To many that are new to, or perhaps looking in at wealth, I think that statement that we just heard from Dr. Grubman at the start of the episode can almost seem paradoxical. However, it's the dilemmas, decisions, and challenges of wealth that can many times create obstacles to managing and transferring wealth for both those new to and coming from wealth. But who is Dr. Grubman, and how does he help families and their advisors?
The focus of my work for about 20 years, going way back to the .com era and before that many people will remember, has been on trying to do two things. One is working directly with individuals, couples, and families on the issues that arise with wealth. And the second is training and consulting and advising to the wealth advisory firms like BKD that work with those clients so that you can know how to help your clients in the best way possible, not just how I work with them.
Now, Dr. Grubman didn't mention that he has also gained international recognition for his renowned book on family wealth, Strangers in Paradise: How Families Adapt to Wealth Across Generations, and as the co-author with Dr. Dennis Jaffe on the book Cross Cultures: Helping Successful Families Adapt Across Generations, which are both groundbreaking explanations of how individuals and families can adjust to wealth effectively. I'm a big fan of his work, and in his book Strangers in Paradise, he talks about what has quickly become known as the immigrants and natives analogy.
It's sort of a cultural approach or model understanding wealth. About 15 years ago and more, a wonderful colleague of mine, Dennis Jaffe, and I were working on an article about the psychology of wealth. And it came to us that the demographics of wealth are something that most people don't really understand. They think wealth is a combination of old wealth and new wealth. But the realities are that about 80%, plus or minus about 5%, of those with wealth have come to that wealth in their lifetime. They are new to wealth. Most people with wealth did not grow up in wealthy families. They were born and raised in middle class or working class life or even poverty. And for a variety of reasons, over the course of their lifetime, they went from one economic culture to a much different socioeconomic culture of wealth, what you might think of as the proverbial land of wealth. As Dennis and I were thinking about this, it dawned on us that actually those who come to wealth have many characteristics of the kind of immigrants who start off from a very difficult land and purposefully make the journey to a much better place to have a better life for their families. We came to this because we often hear things from wealth holders, parents and grandparents, that very much are like what people say in immigrant families. They say, a grandfather or grandmother will say, I look at our grandchildren and I realize they don't have any idea where we came from. They don't have any idea. They have a much easier life. They don't know how hard it was for us. How do I help them keep the values and the skills that were so important to the founding of our success when they have such an easier life? Sometimes people will say, I look at my kids and I'm thinking they're growing up in ways, how do I parent them when I grew up in very different circumstances? How do I do this? So we realize that those who come to wealth are like immigrants to wealth. And the children and grandchildren, they're not immigrants, they're natives of the land of wealth. This is their land. They were born and raised with it. And in some ways, they know it differently and perhaps better in some ways than those who brought the family there. We also have to keep in mind in-laws and partners who get connected to a wealthy family. They are immigrants to wealth as well if they come from middle-class life. So this immigrants and natives metaphor really makes the light bulb go on for a lot of families immediately because they can relate to the experience of having come to wealth or coming from wealth. The book, Strangers in Paradise, helps tease out all of this, provides some interesting stories and examples, and helps people understand what they need to do when they are trying to adjust and adapt to living in the land of wealth.
Now, I don't know about for you, but the light bulb really went off for me, like Dr. Grubman mentioned, with looking at those who come to and come from wealth through the lens of immigrants and natives to the land of wealth. In the book, Dr. Grubman identifies the key process for families of wealth, like all immigrant families, is adapting to new circumstances, in this case, to those that come with adjustments to economic culture.
I think that adapting from one economic culture to another is harder than people anticipate. And many people actually think it's going to be pretty easy, but then they find that they struggle because, well, for example, as we have been talking about, one of the major adaptations that has to occur is in parenting. I hear very often from the families that I work with of the idea of when you grow up in difficult economic circumstances, your kid says, well, I want this toy, or can't we do this or that? Parents say, well, we can't do that. We don't have the money for that. And that's the end of that. When saying we can't either doesn't make sense because of the obvious circumstances of the family, or doesn't feel honest on the part of the parents, even if they live a relatively frugal life, then you're in the territory of, well, how do you handle that? And so the adaptation, for example, in parenting, where you have to go from saying we can't to we won't, making that purchase or doing that thing is just simply not part of our values, is something that families have to move toward in the adaptation. I often talk about the insights from cross-cultural psychology about how you move from one culture to another in general. And there are three main questions of adaptation that individuals and families have to look at in trying to make the adjustment.
A quick spoiler alert here. These questions are really good, and I highly recommend jotting them down.
Number one, what from our heritage and of where we came from can we keep that still serves us well in the new environment and circumstances? The second question, which is often a hard one, what do we let go of that in fact no longer serves us well? And finally, the third question of adaptation is, what do we need to take on? What do we need to learn about the new circumstances where we find ourselves that will serve us well for the future? So those three main questions, what do we keep? What do we let go of? And what do we take on? Provide your guideposts to adjusting from one economic culture to a much better one.
I have found Dr. Grubman's three simple but powerful questions to be incredibly helpful, not only in helping families, but in my own personal life as well. And that's why I recommended jotting them down and revisiting them again later. Now, of course, these questions are, well, only questions if they aren't put to use to help find the right mix of leaning on the past family tradition and taking on new skills to look forward. So what are some best practices or guideposts?
The most important thing, particularly around what do we keep, has to do with the idea of the combination of values and skills in the family, particularly the values. Values can keep you going forward even when there are some things about how you grew up that may have to be changed. I was once working with a young couple where she came from significant wealth as her background. She was native to wealth, and she had married what we would call an immigrant to wealth, a guy who grew up in a very difficult environment, blue collar life. And their kids got to be around teenage years, and one kid finally hit the magic period of age 16, 17 and wanted to have a car. She said, well, of course, in her background, you hit that point and you got a car for mobility and independence. It was not unreasonable. And all of your friends generally had cars, and she didn't see much that was wrong with it. And they began to talk about what kind of car. Her husband was aghast. He said, no way in heck. I never had a car. I took the bus, and that taught me an awful lot. We are not getting him a car. He doesn't deserve a car. He can ride like anybody else. And that was how he felt the situation should be handled. Now, in many families, that would lead to a lot of fighting and discussion, but this couple was able to negotiate and work it out. And what I helped them with was I asked a basic question, which is, what are you trying to teach? What skills do you want your son to have? What values are you trying to demonstrate? And their values and their interests as parents were actually remarkably aligned. They wanted their son to be independent and to understand the value of a dollar. In the end, what they worked out was the father had to let go of, that was part of question number 2, let go of the idea that riding a bus was the way, the mechanism for teaching things. That was a little extreme for the current circumstance. But his wife was able to hear that their son needed to learn skills and needed to not just have things handed to him. So what they agreed on was that they were going to buy a 4 or 5-year-old economy car that was in good shape, had some decent safety measures, but probably was going to require a little maintenance and was not super expensive, because their interest was in having their son learn how to take care of a vehicle, learn about insurance, contribute money to it. So in the end, they were able to work out their different backgrounds by focusing on what are our values, what are the skills that our kids need to have, what are our interests in teaching them. And those were the guideposts that they relied on.
I thought that was a great example of how there are many layers to a situation that may seem simple or everyday, and how focusing on the elements of adaptation can help unpack it and then cover the central issue. In Strangers in Paradise, Dr. Grubman argues it's important for families to find the right balance in their adaptation. Why?
If you go too far one way or the other, it can really impact how the family makes a good adjustment to becoming wealthy. As I talk about in Strangers in Paradise, we know from cross-cultural psychology in the strategies people use in adapting to a new culture, you can cling to the old culture too long and too much and not make the transition. Or you can jump in with both feet and try to assimilate as completely as possible, leaving behind any evidence of where you came from, as opposed to trying to balance out the past, the present, and the future. Going to extremes in either way, too much of the past or too much assimilation, can leave the family struggling. It's integrating, what I call the integrators in the book, that creates the best outcome. To do that, one of the most important things that maybe we can touch on is the issue of communication. Those who say, well, wait a minute, we're just middle-class people who happen to have a lot of money. We don't need to tell our kids. We don't need to show our kids. We don't want to look like we have money. We should just continue to look and act like middle class because that's the best way to be. Unfortunately, that approach has its limitations because you don't talk to the children about the reality of the family, and the children are not prepared for the future to have the values and skills that they need in understanding how to handle wealth responsibly. If you also leave all the past behind and dive into materialism and spending and just enjoy the benefits of rich life, the children are left kind of rootless. They don't have the values and skills that help the family succeed in the first place. So finding that middle blend where the family came from and where the family's going tends to be best, and it does tend to require being able to talk about it.
Now, today is Wednesday, May 20th, 2020, and I spoke to Dr. Grubman in the midst of the global coronavirus pandemic that's clearly had a multifaceted impact on all of us, with tremendous uncertainty and turmoil in the economy, and of course, the personal impacts of the health issues and related anxieties. In light of that, here are some things that families can do in crises like the present situation.
In some ways, what I'm finding is families are discovering whether they have done some of the hard work in adaptation to wealth before this or whether they are struggling. Many of the families that I work with had the idea that they were supposed to develop family meetings, supposed to have family communication where people talk about the family situation, how things work in terms of the family's, perhaps a family business. Those families who did make the effort and take the time to build family communication are now finding that they are getting the benefit of it. They have a vehicle for talking with each other and working on things together that is helping them be resilient and make it through. Those families that discounted it or were afraid of it or put it off and procrastinated about it are now discovering that they're struggling. I can think of one family in particular that I work with where they're having to get up to speed with just the basics of understanding the family. And the children have many anxieties about, are we going to be okay? What's going on? Are we secure? And the parents, who are very anxious because they're worried if they lose a significant amount of money, in a sense, they're going to be deported from the land of wealth and have to go back to middle-class life that they thought they left behind. But those families that have not done that hard work are struggling much more than the ones who have a good, solid vehicle for connecting with each other.
Now, whether we're in the midst of a global pandemic or not, the accountant in me always likes to measure things, and it begs the question that you as a family member might be asking, and that's, how do you know if you and your family are communicating to the extent to which you need to and talking about the right things?
There's a couple things. One is you have to show an openness to being asked questions. Many parents are very afraid about, opening the can of worms. They don't know where those questions are going to go. They don't know what might be asked about. They don't know how much they're going to have to answer things that they're not ready for. If you have already gone through that process in the past and there is a decent understanding, not necessarily in full detail, not necessarily all the numbers, but if there's a decent understanding on the part of everybody in the family about the family's situation and how secure it is, then most of the questions that will arise are specifics. What are we doing to protect the money? Do we need to change what we do as a family, cut back on some things? The questions will be much more specific based upon the learning that's happened before. Families that have not really talked as of yet will have a whole host of questions that are partly specific and partly just general of, are we okay? They don't know the landscape. They don't know the big picture. And that's the damage that's done in not talking about the big picture, that the next generation doesn't understand what is the large perspective of where we are as a family? If that's the case, and those are the kinds of questions that you're getting, you have to start the conversation. A good way to do that is to simply say, we would like to sit down together and talk about the family situation. We're going to explain some things, tell you the big picture, and answer some questions. It is okay to say, all questions are reasonable. Some answers may be deferred to another time. Just because a question is asked doesn't mean you have to answer it, but you do need to show that you are open to questions. But you can dictate the speed and the pace of how answers are given. Keeping it simple and giving high-level answers is really what people most want to hear. I was working with one family not too long ago, and they had a major Zoom call with multiple advisors, 28-year-old, new in the family governance, and they were talking about things and a lot of high-level jargon back and forth with detail about financial statements and things. And finally, the 28-year-old young woman in the family, she said, I just need to ask one basic question. Are we going to be okay? And her father, who was the family leader in the business and within the family governance, understood that she asked a great question. And he answered it simply. And he said, as we sit here now, things could change, but basically, yes, we're going to be okay. And it changed the whole tone of the call that they were on. You need to be able to answer the real questions that the family is asking and to be able to bring people together so that they can cope as best as possible.
Based on the many families I've talked to, and even in my own personal family experience, having these sorts of conversations and showing an openness to answering the real questions, as Dr. Grubman just said, can be uncomfortable and is often uncharted territory. Here are some tips and techniques for opening up the dialogue and facilitating communication in your family.
To get the ball rolling on communication, there are some basic principles. One is realize this is not a business meeting. This is a family meeting. This is family communication. This is not talking at the family, giving them information, and then drawing the meeting to a close. This is a discussion. You need to be able to be clear on what's going to be discussed, just in general terms. You have to describe information and give an outline, but then you have to stop. You have to make room for people to respond with reactions, with questions. Sometimes people will be surprised. Sometimes people will be relieved. Sometimes people will be scared or angry or irritated or frustrated. I think what many people are afraid of in communication is the reactions and the emotions that may come up. It's important for the parents and, in a sense, perhaps the leaders in the family to show that you can receive those things. You can take them in and hear them. And all that's required is to be able to listen, to hear the family's concerns. Try not to get defensive if you can. Try not to launch into big explanations and problem solving. People initially, particularly early in opening up communication, may have a lot of pent up questions and reactions. Once you get past those first reactions, it often settles down and people feel relieved that they've cleared the air on things. So to be able to be patient and tolerant of whatever comes up, and to realize what your main goal is to share some information, but it also is to draw the family together and reinforce the values and the bonds of the family, which will help you weather the storm.
At 10 a.m. Central this morning, Wednesday, May 20, 2020, Dr. Grubman and I will sit down, virtually of course, for a webinar that BKD is hosting on maintaining your emotional balance during taxing times, where we'll explore the emotional effect of market volatility, uncertainty, and social disruption in challenging times. You're probably listening to this after the webinar, or perhaps as a result of attending the webinar. but you can view an archive of the presentation using the link in the show notes of this episode. So why do I mention a webinar on understanding stress during financial crises? Stress hijacks the brain and our ability to maintain equilibrium in extreme conditions. And this can happen as well when faced with the possible stress and anxiety of having the types of family conversations that Dr. Grubman just discussed, and in one way in particular.
I think one of the commonalities that we are talking about with the discussion in the webcast about coping with the markets is the idea of what I call the white noise factor. When we're nervous, insecure, worried about the future, feeling like we're dealing with too much uncertainty and volatility in life, not just in the markets, it's really hard to concentrate. We're very preoccupied. And I think for families, when they're working on drawing the family together under these stressful circumstances, it's the parents, perhaps, who are helpful in decreasing the white noise factor. We talk in the webinar about how the frontal lobes of the brain are higher order thinking skills, understand and manage gains that occur in the market. But it is the deep, ancient parts of the brain in the limbic system that get scared when there are losses and fears and uncertainties going on. It actually brings in different parts of our brains if we're under stress. And it's the same way when families feel insecure and need some reassurance, or at the very least, need some honesty and some openness. That if you have to say, we're not sure, you can say that. Just adding to it, but we'll figure it out and we're going to be together while we do it. That we are all in the same storm. And right now, what we have to remember is we're also in the same boat and we'll take care of each other.
If you're like me, when dealing with areas where I'm inexperienced or perhaps feeling a little over my skis, as they say, I like to bring in some help or turn to someone as a resource. Dr. Grubman suggests doing the same with family conversations as well.
If you haven't grown up with open communication or anything even remotely like doing a family meeting, it can be a pretty daunting process. One of the things I find that actually clients often don't think of when they think of an advisory firm like you guys is you have a lot of experience dealing with families living in the land of wealth. You've helped people do family meetings, open family communication. So I would just remind everybody that if you are feeling awkward with it or not sure where to start, turn to your advisors because the firm may have a variety of resources, articles, tips and techniques about starting family communication, having discussions with kids about values and skills, even nitty-gritty sorts of things like, should you do an allowance? How do you do an allowance? And, how do you build money skills otherwise?
So now that we've unpacked the psychology of both coming to and coming from wealth, let's bring the conversation full circle.
In drawing things together, I would go back to something we talked about in the beginning about immigrants and natives, which is adapting to wealth is often harder than people anticipate. When you come out of difficult economic circumstances, mostly what you're focused on is having relief from the stresses and strains of not having enough money. And you imagine that once all that is gone, life will be wonderful and it'll be smooth sailing. We don't typically picture that you will encounter new stresses, different stresses in the land of wealth. We only picture about being freed from where we came from. So I think for those who are listening, if you have found it harder than anticipated to deal with some of the dilemmas and decisions and choices that come up, the situations, raising children, dealing with family or old friendships, trying to decide purchases, how you use your money and your wealth, how to deal with success. If you're finding that it's harder than you thought, my message is you are absolutely not alone. Adjusting to a new culture, including economic culture, is hard. Give yourself time to adapt. Try and be flexible. Again, there may be some things that you're going to keep that will serve you well. There may be some things that actually you've been holding on to that you need to let go of that have been getting in your way of adapting. And there may be some new things to learn that will be your guide going forward. If you can find that blend that fits you, you're going to be okay.
I find myself frequently circling back to Dr. Grubman's work, as I think his way of explaining and breaking down the complexities of the psychology of wealth for those adapting from one economic culture to another does a great job of cutting through the static of the complex world of wealth. Please learn more about Dr. Grubman at his website, jamesgrubman.com, which we've included a link to, along with links to his books Strangers in Paradise and Cross Cultures in the show notes to this episode, available at bkd.com/simplytax. Please leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast. Let us know what you think. You can connect and learn more about me out on social media. You can find me on Twitter, where I tweet about tax at Damien Martin CPA, on Instagram, where I post about my life at the intersection of tax and being a dad at TaxDad, on YouTube by subscribing to our Simply Tax YouTube channel, and out on LinkedIn. I'm Damien Martin, and thank you for listening.
The information contained in this episode of Simply Tax is based on data available as of the date of its release. BKD is under no obligation to update this information if changes occur. Applying this information to your specific situation requires careful consideration of all facts and circumstances. Any information provided is not to be considered as tax, legal, or financial advice. Please consult your tax advisor before acting on any matters covered.